On May 10, 2022, Yoon Suk Yeol was sworn in as the 20th President of the Republic of Korea. President Yoon came to office at a time of crisis. Koreans continue to feel the effects of the pandemic on their daily lives and the economy. Many of the issues that animated the campaign, such as the rising cost of living, jobs, and gender equality, have presented persistent challenges for the new president. On the international stage, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's growing assertiveness were rapidly reshaping Korea's foreign policy options. To look more deeply at the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for the Yoon administration in this pivotal time, KEI has turned to a range of experts to explore the outlook on 10 critical issues facing the Republic of Korea over the next 5 years.
U.S.-Korea relations are important to both countries, and most likely are going to remain close and productive, but that should not be taken for granted. There have been times in the past, and I'm thinking of the 1980s, when anti-American demonstrations were common in South Korea, and future differences could emerge between the two countries. Washington and Seoul need to pay continuing attention to the relationship. I don't believe that U.S.-Korea relations would have been very different over the next 3 years if a progressive South Korean president had been elected rather than a conservative. One piece of evidence to support that is that during the Korean presidential campaign, both sides endorsed the joint statement that had been agreed to during the May 2021 Biden-Moon summit. That is a detailed and ambitious blueprint for the relationship. And it's true in Washington as well. During a time when almost everything is subject to partisanship, there is strong support for the U.S.-Korea alliance among both Democrats and Republicans. But in saying that the relationship is built on strong fundamentals, I'm not saying that it is unchanging. At a time when the global environment is in flux, it would be illogical to assume that U.S.-Korea relations would stay the same. Over the past few years, those looking for points of friction between the United States and Korea have pointed to North Korea and China. But it's hard to identify any specific actual problems. Under Presidents Biden and Moon, there was close consultation on diplomacy towards North Korea. There were some in Seoul, as there were some in Washington, who urged more unilateral concessions towards North Korea to promote peace. But neither government got out in front of the other. Even when Moon Jae-in proposed his end-of-war declaration, the two administrations together discussed the merits of the idea. In the end, it did not go forward. And that is a sign of cooperation, not difference. On China, commentators have talked about the need for South Korea to choose sides between the United States and China, but there never was a single decision like that to make. In practice, rather than drawing closer to China, Korea has been diversifying its investments to reduce its dependence on China. And public opinion polling shows the South Korean public views China increasingly as a threat rather than as a partner. There's one other issue that's sometimes mentioned as a U.S.-Korea problem, and that is the fact that regular joint military exercises have not been taking place as they used to. Now, those who hold the Moon administration responsible for that seem to have forgotten that it was President Trump who suspended the joint military exercises, and he did so without consulting South Korea. That one's on us. Going forward, the U.S.-Korea agenda is expanding. The urgent issues before us include climate change, securing supply chains, defending democracy, and dealing with technological advances. Because the United States and South Korea are both advanced democratic free market economies, they're going to agree more often than not on what needs to be done. That said, there are three aspects of the U.S.-Korea relationship that will require particular attention. One is a challenge created by the change of gears between a strictly bilateral relationship and multilateralism. In the past, it was enough for Washington and Seoul to talk mostly about bilateral issues. In a break from the past, the Biden administration seems focused on flexible groupings of countries to deal with common challenges. More and more of the U.S.-Korea conversation is going to be about which groups of countries should carry out which tasks. That will be something new. Second, Korea remains predominantly a trading country, while the U.S. seems to be pulling back from expanding trade. The Biden administration is highlighted by American policies, and in his 2022 State of the Union message, President Biden did not use the words trade or exports. Korean investment in the U.S. is impressive and mitigates, but does not eliminate, possible trade frictions. Despite talking about a new Indo-Pacific economic framework, the U.S. seems uninterested in increasing trade volumes, and that is a break from the past. Third, it simply is a fact that the U.S. has become an unpredictable country, and that also is something new. The Trump administration treated South Korea very differently from the Obama administration, and the Biden administration has executed another sharp turn in U.S. foreign policy. It is altogether reasonable for South Korea to want to strengthen its relations with other countries to hedge against another possible shift in U.S. foreign policy after the 2024 U.S. elections. We would do the same if we were in their shoes. But in the end, the safest prediction is the United States and Korea will remain close friends and strong partners because they want the same thing, a stable, prosperous, and sustainable future.
I see the long arc of North Korea policy for both South Korea and the United States, beginning with the escalation of tensions in the fall of 2017, then pivoting very quickly to the summit era, which included not only summits with the American president and North-South, but also with President Xi Jinping of China and a relaxation of tensions there, but then ending with the profound failure of the Hanoi summit. And I think virtually everything in North Korea policy since 2019 has rotated on the failure of that summit and the expectations Kim Jong-un had that he would be able to secure some sanctions relief. We know from the Bolton memoir, which has detailed descriptions of how that summit played out, that Kim Jong-un believed that he could get into a room with President Trump and get an offer on the table that would involve quite substantial sanctions relief from major UN Security Council sanctions in return for something that was quite vague with respect to Yongbyon. When President Trump walked away from that offer, the decline in the administration's interest in the North Korean issue was swift. And basically, through the rest of his tenure, there was not much movement of any sort. Now, North Korea sat on this failure for a year, but starting in the end of 2019 and into a series of statements that begin in early 2020, at the fifth plenum, into the eighth party Congress, and now into this year, you see a much darker tone in North Korea's official pronouncements with respect to the future. Those statements are negative with respect to the expectations that any sanctions relief will be forthcoming, and correspondingly negative about the impact of the external environment on the North Korean economy. You're seeing more and more of a self-reliance trope surfacing. So the North Korean economy now faces three shocks, not two, not just the sanctions imposed on commercial trade and the closure of the border, which may have been rational given North Korea's fragile healthcare system. But something I'm going to be watching closely is the rapid increase in food prices globally and the way in which North Korea could get caught in another humanitarian crisis that the Biden and Yoon administrations will have to manage. I see the problem facing the Yoon and Biden administrations that there's basically very little that the United States or South Korea can do at this juncture that would get North Korea back to the negotiating table. The type of concessions that would be necessary, like granting sanctions relief in advance of negotiations, are just really not politically feasible. And so then the question really becomes, should the effort continue on the part of the Biden and Yoon administrations to offer talks, or should we transit to a strategy, as incoming President Yoon suggests, of a tougher approach to North Korea by ratcheting up sanctions? I have to say that I'm relatively dubious that a harder line is going to yield anything other than a continuation of tests. It will be difficult to do this. It will involve secondary sanctions on Chinese entities. But the most important point is that China clearly stands ready, now joined by Russia, to make sure that any toughening of sanctions is basically offset by smuggling and sanctions evasion, which has become systemic and I think will now extend to Russia as well as China. So I'm sorry to end on a relatively pessimistic note for this short clip, But I think we're basically in a containment world where the prospect of negotiations is extremely limited. And the US and South Korea should be focusing on the deterrent, to be sure. But I think we should be focusing on a wider array of issues that don't have anything to do with North Korea, and just building resilience and capacity within the alliance rather than worrying about the deterrence problem, which we have a reasonably good capacity to manage.
So in terms of the reality of the South Korea-China relations, I think Beijing has perceived the inauguration of the new Yoon administration as posing significant uncertainty to the relationship between Beijing and Seoul. And this is not just because President Yoon, during his election campaign, has vowed to consolidate and strengthen South Korea's alliance relationship with the United States, as well as to recalibrate or distance South Korea away from China. I think the Chinese are more concerned about the overall change of trend in the region, which is that under the Biden administration, US is trying to consolidate and strengthen its alliances and partnerships in the region. And for the past 10 years, China has or had perceived South Korea as a victory for the Chinese competition for regional influence with the United States. That the success of China, for example, to convince South Korea to join AIIB and convince former President Park to join the military parade in Beijing back in 2015, those were all signs that the Chinese believe that the neutrality that China wants to see from South Korea between US and China is being gradually achieved and also consolidated. But now with President Yoon, what the Chinese has perceived is, well, all the achievements for the past 10 years, it could be reversed by the new administration in Seoul, and the Chinese have to contemplate what is the consequences of that. On top of that, there's of course the issue of North Korea, where the Chinese also perceive that North Korea is both China's strategic asset in terms of leverage against South Korea, but at the same time, it's also a major strategic liability. So for example, at this time, I think we are all anticipating that North Korea will provoke in the foreseeable future. But for the Chinese, that's like the worst case scenario for China-South Korea relations, because the Chinese know very well that by the time that North Korea provokes, South Korea is going to turn to both US and China for assistance. And the assistance that China can provide is going to be unsatisfactory and will be very limited. So as a result, or the consequences of that is that US-South Korea security alliance will be consolidated and strengthened as a result of North Korea provocation, and China has everything to lose, which is why the Chinese are particularly concerned about a North Korean provocation at this time. But looking at President Yoon's China policy, I would say that he also faces significant challenges for this recalibration to be conducted or implemented. At a minimum, China remains to be the largest trading partner of South Korea, and I believe that export to China constitute about 25.3% of South Korea's total export. It's not that China is going to react with a major economic sanction like what we saw in 2016 against the THAAD deployment decision, at least not for the beginning of President Yoon's presidency. But after a year, and if Beijing does decide and draws a conclusion that South Korea has irreversibly, at least under the Yoon administration, irreversibly changed its alignment choices between US and China and decides to antagonize China on issues related to, for example, the regional security framework, then I think more severe actions or retaliations will be on its way from the Chinese perspective.
The current state of relations between South Korea and Japan is, in the judgment of many observers, the worst since normalization in 1965. Despite decades of interaction, cooperation, and even integration, Korea and Japan seem to have reverted to a dysfunctional status in which even the most basic forms of diplomatic intercourse present a challenge. It is worth noting that South Korean President Moon Jae-in left office in May without ever having carried out an official visit to Japan or hosting a Japanese premiere in Seoul. The repair of the shattered state of Korea's relations with Japan is already high on the agenda of the incoming administration of Yoon Suk Yeol. President Yoon came to office having campaigned on the need to improve relations with Japan and a critique of the previous administration's failure to take steps in that direction. The task has a new urgency, however, thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the threat this represents to the global order on which both Korea and Japan depend. Ironically, perhaps, the Russian invasion and the brutal war that has unfolded in Europe evokes parallels with the Korean War. The result of those events was the creation of the Cold War security system in East Asia that remains remarkably intact to this day. The US security alliances with Korea and Japan were born out of the Korean War. And while a formal NATO-like security structure never emerged, there is a de facto linkage between the defense of Korea from the ongoing threat from the North and the security of Japan. The United States has long stressed the need for trilateral security cooperation, and the Biden administration is pushing hard on both Seoul and Tokyo to at least restore normality to their relations. The US urges both sides to focus on their shared interests and common perception of threats, first of all from North Korea, but also from China's hegemonic ambitions in the region. The stated desire to unfreeze relations is not, however, sufficient. Strategic imperatives cannot substitute for a serious effort to address the underlying issues that have driven Korea and Japan apart. The state of Korea-Japan relations is clear evidence of the power and persistence of wartime historical memory issues and their embedded role in the formation of national identity. The starting point for the current decline is the decision of the outgoing Moon administration to effectively dismantle the 2015 agreement to provide compensation and apology to the surviving so-called comfort women, the Korean women dragooned into sexual servitude by the Japanese Imperial Army. The Democratic Party of Korea had opposed the agreement, largely on the grounds that the main organization representing the surviving women had not been formally consulted. That move by the Moon administration was compounded by Tokyo's narrow and misleading interpretation of that agreement as marking an end to any public commemoration of this crime. Tensions had already begun to mount from the fall of 2018 when the Korean Supreme Court ruled that the Japanese firms Nippon Steel, Sumitomo Metal, and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries must pay compensation to Korean forced laborers used by Japan during the wartime period. Until this ruling, both the Korean and Japanese governments had agreed that such claims had been settled by the 1965 treaty. The history disputes then spread into security and economic realms. In late 2018, a South Korean warship directed its fire control radar at a Japanese maritime patrol aircraft. Attempts to resolve the incident through direct talks between the two militaries ended in acrimonious dispute over who was responsible for the incident. The following year, in July 2019, the Japanese government took the unprecedented step of imposing export controls on key inputs for semiconductor production supplied to Korea. The following month, the Moon administration announced it would not continue an agreement on defense intelligence sharing with Japan. Only American intervention prevented this decision from being carried out. Subsequent contradictory court decisions in Korea on compensation to comfort women and forced laborers further complicated matters. Both the Yoon administration and the Kishida cabinet have expressed a desire to turn the page on these disputes and open a new chapter. Korea is eager to explore an association with the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue and membership in the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact. But the domestic political dimension of the Korea-Japan relationship will continue to pose a challenge to both governments. President Yoon already faces criticism for being pro-Japanese, and Prime Minister Kishida is under pressure from the right wing of the ruling conservative Liberal Democratic Party not to make concessions on the key history issues. Ultimately, a solution must be found to the issues of historical justice if relations are to be put on a solid footing. The legal and political barriers can be overcome with leadership and skilled diplomacy. As the war in Ukraine widens, the sense of strategic urgency in both Tokyo and Seoul should grow deeper as well. But the weight of history cannot be easily thrown off.
Throughout the former Moon Jae-in administration, one of the key developments in South Korea's foreign affairs was the elevation of relations with Southeast Asia and India vis-à-vis the New Southern Policy. It's of great interest for the international community as to how the new Yoon Suk Yeol administration will take on the legacy of the New Southern Policy as well as its lingering challenges to align it with its own foreign policy objectives throughout the next 5 years. In forecasting and analyzing the future trends of South Korea's relations with its Southeast Asian partners, we can build on the New Southern Policy's 3Ps framework from the former Moon administration: people, prosperity, and peace. With regards to the people pillar, the Yoon administration will have to deal with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the people-to-people exchanges. For example, how can South Korea effectively continue to engage with Southeast Asia on the vast list of non-traditional security challenges, including global health, climate change, and the provision of vaccines? How can Seoul continue to amplify its image as a global goods provider under the new administration? These will be crucial questions for the Yoon administration as it re-engages in various summits, working level groups, and promotes people-to-people exchanges at the ground level. Prosperity-related issues, such as those underlying technology and economic security, are also important considerations for the Yoon administration. Supply chain resilience and overdependence on China, for example, are shared concerns among South Korea and Southeast Asian countries, and the Yoon administration has vowed to take a stronger stance against China. Seoul, along with Washington, can help take the lead on this front in areas such as manufacturing and development of semiconductors, large capacity batteries, and other areas of vulnerability. Another way of tackling China's overriding influence in the digital realm would be for South Korea to work with the US and other like-minded countries to help establish digital infrastructure in developing areas in Southeast Asia so that the digital economy could be more diversified away from China. A more domestic consideration would include South Korea's own diversification of engagement within Southeast Asia, as it has traditionally been more heavily reliant on Vietnam compared to other ASEAN member states. Hence, important trends under the prosperity pillar include the Yoon administration's contributions to the wider regional efforts towards supply chain resilience, as well as more domestic efforts to achieve diversification within Southeast Asia. It's in the peace pillar where we may see greater changes under the Yoon administration over the next 5 years, as many experts view it as the most neglected pillar of the 3 by the former Moon administration. First and foremost, the New Southern Policy itself seems likely to be reframed and incorporated as a part of South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy framework, which sends a positive signal for South Korea's heightened cooperation with the US and Japan in promoting peace and stability within the region. Yet there are concerns that this may not be as welcomed by the Southeast Asian partners, since it means that Southeast Asia would be a part of a larger strategy, an action that could be mistranslated as a lowering of Southeast Asia's regional priority for South Korea. As such, in line with larger concerns as to how the US and South Korea each defines its regional Indo-Pacific strategy or policy, it will be important for the Yoon administration to reassure its Southeast Asian partners of steadfast dedication, especially as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or other mechanisms take further shape. An additional consideration would be the role of Southeast Asia as a platform for reconciliation between South Korea and Japan, since their trilateral coordination with the US has been stressed by the new administration. Southeast Asia is an important area for achieving this, since Japan is a lead donor country for ASEAN, with ASEAN viewing it as one of the most trustworthy and amicable foreign partners. Overall, the Yoon administration now faces the challenge of extending South Korea's cooperation with Southeast Asia by building on the initiatives set by the New Southern Policy. This will entail greater people-to-people engagement, heightened cooperation in functional areas including technology and economic sectors, and further coordination with other responsible stakeholders, including the US.
The domestic economy may have been the most important consideration for South Korean voters as they went to the polls in April, but for a country as globally integrated as Korea, the importance of foreign markets as a source for growth cannot be understated. Among the world's 10 largest economies, Korea is only behind Germany in its export dependence, with exports constituting about 40% of GDP. It was also demand for these goods that helped the Korean economy shrink the least among OECD countries in 2020 after the initial shock of the pandemic. For newly elected Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, ensuring the competitiveness and resiliency of Korean exports amid new challenges will be of paramount importance. Even before the emergence of COVID-19, Korea was one of the countries that took the most collateral damage from the US-China trade war. The pandemic has not only exacerbated this pressure on Seoul, but added a long list of other issues to address after widespread disruptions have raised questions about the existing structure of global supply chains. One of the core issues for Yoon's trade agenda will be how to manage ties with China, Korea's largest trading partner by far. In 2021, the $162 billion in exports sent to China was more than what was sent to the second and third largest destinations combined. Beyond the costs of possible disruptions as seen during the pandemic, Beijing's willingness to weaponize this interdependence, as demonstrated by the THAAD incident, has laid bare the risks in this relationship. Yoon's predecessor, Moon Jae-in, tried to diversify Korea's partners through initiatives such as the New Southern and New Northern policies. While both have their own successes to point to, they have had a limited impact on Korea's reliance on trade with China. Yoon is more overtly critical of China than Moon was, so it might seem as if he'll be more assertive on this front, but he'll be running into the same major structural challenges. This will particularly hold true for semiconductors. The pandemic has highlighted just how important chips are to the modern economy, and Korea is home to some of the world's largest chip makers. This dependence, however, works both ways. Semiconductors are by far Korea's single most important export category, and China is again by far the largest destination. The matter is further complicated by how the United States is looking to decouple supply chains with China in high-tech industries with national security implications, including semiconductors. Yoon may be emphasizing the importance of strengthening the US-Korea alliance, but alliance issues are now more complex than when his conservative predecessors were in office, as the scope of the relationship has broadened. On semiconductors, Yoon will need to strike a delicate balance between listening to business leaders and promoting job growth at home on the one hand, and cooperating with the Biden administration and their efforts to shore up supply chains, including attracting Korean investment to build plants in the U.S. on the other. More broadly, the U.S. stepping down from its traditional leadership role on trade has raised questions about the future of the global economic order, which Korea is highly reliant on. In the region, instead of returning to the CPTPP, the White House is instead pursuing its own Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is expected to fall short of the needs and wants of many market economies in the region. Japan and others have been able to steward some trade agreements in the U.S.'s stead, but it's not clear how sustainable this will be, particularly as China is looking to take a more involved role in steering regional economic networks. Despite all these challenges that lie ahead for Yoon, there is plenty of room for him to shape Korea's trade trajectory over the next 5 years. Key to this will be Yoon making good on his promises for Korea to take on more responsibilities and leadership roles where possible. Beyond participating in the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific economic framework, Yoon will also need to build momentum from the twilight months of the Moon Administration and join the CPTPP to ensure higher standard trade rules. In the same vein, he'll also need to follow through on Korea's bid to join the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, the world's first digital trade pact. Yoon may additionally seek to play a more active role in multilateral institutions, such as an expanded G7, but could be wary of antagonizing China. With so much potentially at stake, Yoon will need to make the most of a strategic and economic environment in flux, which he can only do by being proactive.
South Korea is known for its innovative technologies, and many South Koreans see digitalization as the future of the Korean economy. During the presidential election, we saw many technology-related proposals ranging from the artificial intelligence, semiconductors, metaverse, to space programs. The President Yoon Suk Yeol wants to take digitalization a step further, and there are potential opportunities that could push South Korea further in the advancement of technological innovation. Digital transformation was President Yoon's first campaign promise, and he promised that the digital platform government as the way for South Korea to consolidate all the government agencies into a single platform that would provide transparency, efficient civil services. The objective would be to create the world's greatest AI cloud computing infrastructure to provide personalized services to people according to their needs. In July, the Yoon administration took the first step in realizing this vision with the launch of the Presidential Committee of Digital Platform Government. The committee is composed of about 30 members from the private and public sectors with the goal of completing the digital platform government initiative within 3 years. This will require extensive use of AI, big data, and the cloud to consolidate the vast amount of information in one platform. Major challenges for this digital platform government would not only be the complexity of the project, but also cybersecurity concern. One platform for all government services means those services are also vulnerable to attack that could affect all of them. Proper security measures will be needed in place to keep all the sensitive information accessible but also safe from cyber attacks. Previous administrations also proposed similar plans, but also unable to fully reach their goal of having one-stop site for all. Yoon's proposals will be an expansion of cooperation among government agencies for a better understanding of people's needs and what he called greater connectivity and communication with the public. But he could face similar challenges in achieving the goal within deadlines since this is such a massive project to carry out. Second, President Yoon wants more private sector-led innovation in emerging technologies such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, electric batteries, 5G, 6G, and biotech. This is different than the previous Moon administration, which envisioned the government playing more of an integrator role when partnering with the private sector through its Digital New Deal. While private sector-led, these initiatives will still need to be closely coordinated with the government, not only to help with funding, but also to implement policy changes. It would also depend on how much political capital the administration is willing to use to push forward certain initiatives, as other domestic issues could easily take higher priorities. Lastly, President Yoon has repeatedly said that he will ease regulation within the tech industry to allow more innovation. On the campaign trail, he advocated for negative regulation, which means laying out what is not possible rather than limiting what is possible. He emphasized this regulation would benefit not only the SMEs, but also startups in emerging technologies and ventures. There are also continuing issues and tension with global tech companies, such as network usage fees and in-app purchase requirements that were heatedly debated among South Korean government officials. With global tech competition heating up and the United States pushing to develop digital rules in its newly launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, how Yoon's government approaches these issues will become increasingly important in foreign policy, the digital economy, and digital trade. South Korea has a history of benefiting from government-led initiatives to drive innovation and fund key infrastructure and research and development programs in the past. With technology evolving day by day, Yoon's tech policy will shape what innovation would look like in the next 5 years.
South Korea has managed the pandemic well. It has been one of the more successful countries in minimizing the number of deaths and infections from COVID-19. It has also managed to avoid significant economic decline in 2020, unlike most of the world's major economies. Despite these overall successes, South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk Yeol, will continue to face challenges from the pandemic domestically, internationally, and in relations to North Korea during his time in office. Even with the successful development and deployment of COVID-19 vaccines to much of the world, the virus continues to evolve relatively quickly. The dominant Omicron variant was first detected in November of 2021, but we are now seeing the spread of subvariants BA4 and BA5. While Omicron has been relatively mild, it has also been significantly more contagious than prior variants. With the virus continuing to evolve, the Yoon administration potentially faces an endemic virus in COVID-19 and the possibility that future variants could be more lethal. Domestically, the Yoon administration in its early days has taken steps to loosen COVID restrictions and to provide support to small business owners and the self-employed who have seen their businesses or income hurt by the pandemic. In time, however, new variants may require additional restrictions or financial support for industries most affected by the pandemic. On the international level, South Korea's contribution to fighting the pandemic trails that of other nations. For example, despite being the world's 10th largest economy, South Korea is not among the 25 top countries and territories in terms of donations to COVAX. The Yoon Administration took initial steps to address this issue by pledging to provide $300 million to the WHO's Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator from 2023 to 2025. However, South Korea is well placed to contribute more financially to ending the pandemic. South Korea has the lowest level of debt to GDP among the world's 10 largest economies and also has had a relatively strong economic recovery from the pandemic. With South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol having called for South Korea to step up on issues such as the pandemic and to take on a global role more befitting of its status as one of the world's 10 largest economies, how South Korea can contribute to dealing with the pandemic globally will remain an issue. The Yoon administration, however, will also have to deal with the implications of COVID-19 in North Korea. After 2 years of claiming to have no cases of COVID-19, Pyongyang announced its first case in mid-May. While the reported numbers have declined since peaking at around 400,000 suspected cases a day, the spread of COVID to North Korea has 3 implications for South Korea related to assisting with the management of the pandemic in the north, encouraging a level of transparency from Pyongyang, and how the pandemic shapes North Korea in the long term. While North Korea is reported to have accepted limited amounts of aid to deal with its outbreak, it is still in need of assistance. Because North Korea lacks a sufficient testing regime, it has resorted to reporting cases of fever rather than COVID. While COVID can cause fever, not all fevers are COVID-related, and not all COVID cases result in a fever. To have a good understanding of the situation in North Korea, international collaboration to ensure adequate testing is necessary. In addition to testing, North Korea will need access to vaccines to treat the population. Much of the population will become exposed to COVID in the current outbreak, but the population as a whole will not, and vaccines will help to provide additional protection against future waves of COVID. It will also need access to equipment and therapeutics to treat individuals with COVID. Encouraging transparency related to the pandemic will also be an issue. With the possibility of new variants developing in North Korea, there is a need for periodic genetic sequencing of the COVID strains circulating in the north. Lastly, the pandemic has resulted in a North Korea that is even more closed off from the world than it was previously. If COVID does become endemic, how will that change North Korea? Will Pyongyang choose to maintain its tight controls on trade and travel? What implications would a more isolated North Korea have for its society and future negotiations? These are some of the pandemic-related uncertainties that the Yoon administration will need to navigate with North Korea over the next 5 years.
During the presidential election, gender issues were one of the most contentious points leading up to the election day. There were heated debates over whether the structural discrimination still exists in South Korean society and whether or not the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family should be abolished. In fact, abolishing the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family was then candidate Yoon Suk Yeol's key campaign promise to young male voters in their 20s, those who believe the ministry favors women in policies and government initiatives. However, President Yoon did not include the abolishment of the ministry in his 110 national test, which was released during his first week of office. When questioned, Yoon and the ruling People Power Party said they still plan to keep the campaign promise. In early May, the PPP leadership proposed amendments to the Government Organization Act, which included abolishing the ministry. In late July, President Yoon asked for a roadmap to abolish the ministry shortly after his meeting with Mr. Kim Hyun-suk. The ministry has launched a task force to work on the plan to distribute its existing responsibilities, such as supporting single-parent families, providing child care services, and helping the victims of sexual crimes. Of course, there are logistical and legal challenges to abolishing or reforming a government agency. Even with the People Power Party gaining few more seats in the recent local election, the opposition Democratic Party still holds an overwhelming majority in the National Assembly. Therefore, this would be structurally very difficult, if not nearly impossible, for the ruling party. There will, however, be a National Assembly election 2024. This election will be crucial for President Yoon and both the ruling and the opposition parties, as it will decide who controls the National Assembly. Depending on the election result, the momentum for the government reforms could change. In the meantime, President Yoon did abolish the gender quota precedent set by previous administration, which was designed to appoint more women to presidential cabinet positions. Yoon argued that positions should be strictly merit-based and not according to gender or regional distribution. South Korea already has very low numbers of women in political leadership positions, as well as in the public sector in general. Dismantling this gender quota will make it increasingly difficult to address gender issues at the policy level. South Korean women are one of the most educated population in the world. Yet, South Korea places the lowest in many gender equality indexes. The country has the largest gender wage gap and ranks the lowest on the Economist Glass Ceiling Index among OECD countries. South Korean women often leave the workforce to raise children and have difficulty returning, causing an M shape as opposed to U shape common among more advanced countries. With extremely high childcare costs, pressure and discrimination from employers, and lack of job security, many South Korean women reconsider having children or even getting married altogether. And we see this reflected in South Korea's low birth rate. These layers of social issues related to gender inequality in South Korea will affect South Korea's economy in the long term and will prevent the country from fully reaching its economic potential. As studies show, the disadvantages of South Korean women faced in society have real economic implications that will become increasingly visible as economic growth slows down. Prior to the pandemic, the IMF estimated that if Korea was able to boost female labor force participation to the level of male labor force participation by 2035, it would see real GDP growth of 7%. Of course, these issues cannot be solved overnight, and action by the government will be crucial to addressing many of these structural challenges. However, with an already low approval rate at the beginning of his term, President Yoon is under pressure to secure his support base and carry out campaign promises. In absence of political will on these social issues, the situation is not likely to improve much during Yoon's administration. As witnessed during the election, there will be an increased spotlight on Yoon's gender policy, both domestically and internationally. We will continue to see heated public debates on these issues until real change is achieved.
Addressing climate change is both a global and a local challenge. It is also one that the Yoon administration will be dealing with over the next 5 years as it shapes its policies on economic competitiveness, energy, and national security. While South Korea is only the world's 13th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, on a per capita basis, it is one of the world's most significant emitters. Largely due to its highly industrialized economy, South Korea emits 11.7 tons of carbon dioxide per capita. This places it among the world's most carbon-intense economies. Excluding smaller economies such as the Faroe Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, and Luxembourg, the only economies with larger per capita emissions than South Korea are the United States and Canada. The prior Yoon administration took two significant steps to address South Korea's emissions that the new South Korean president, Yoon Suk Yeol, has inherited. In 2020, South Korea pledged to become carbon neutral by 2050, and at COP26 in Glasgow last year, Seoul pledged to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030 from 2018 levels. The Yoon administration has pledged to uphold both of these pledges. While the Climate Action Tracker has assessed South Korea's pledge to reduce emissions by 40% this decade as insufficient, meeting this target will be a challenge for South Korea. In 2019, industry accounted for 28.4% of South Korea's GDP. In contrast, only 16.4% of the European Union's GDP came from industry, while only 11% of the United States' GDP is from industry. Because South Korea's emissions reductions will need to take place in a little less than a decade, they will also need to proceed at a faster pace than other major economies. Preliminary estimates also suggest that this challenge will be made more difficult because last year, South Korea's emissions are believed to have risen for the first time since they peaked in 2018. If South Korea is unable to achieve its 2030 emissions reductions, its goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 will also likely be out of reach. With the Yoon administration in office until May 2027, the course it charts on South Korea's energy policy will determine whether South Korea is able to achieve its objectives. Beyond climate change, another factor, however, for the Yoon administration will be South Korea's long-term economic competitiveness. Government rules and corporate policies in multiple countries are moving in a direction that will place pressure on South Korea to reduce its emission. The United States, the European Union, for example, are entering into talks to establish standards for reducing emissions from steel. As two of South Korea's largest export markets for steel, new US and EU standards will shape the emissions targets of South Korea's steel industry. Global corporations are also going to be a factor. Major firms, such as Apple, have begun requiring their suppliers to move towards carbon neutrality. In some cases, South Korean firms, especially semiconductor firms, may be able to meet these pledges by supplying semiconductors to major firms from factories outside of South Korea. However, over time, this would hollow out South Korea's own manufacturing sector. National security will likely also be a factor in the Yoon administration's climate and energy policies. With price increases and fuel shortages resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine, South Korea will need to focus in the near term on how to secure its energy supply chains. Seoul is dependent on energy imports for nearly all of its energy supply, with Russia accounting for about 9% of South Korea's fossil fuels. Specifically, Russia accounted for 6% of South Korea's crude oil imports last year, about 5% of its LNG imports, and 17.5% of South Korea's imports of coal. In the short term, the Yoon administration will need to work with allies to ensure adequate energy supplies, especially if there are further restrictions on imports from Russia. But another way to strengthen South Korea's energy security would be to advance plans to transition to renewable fuels and lessen South Korea's dependence on fossil fuels, something that would work in tandem with the administration's emissions reduction efforts. Whether it is for reasons of international cooperation, economic competitiveness, or national security, climate change and energy policy will remain a focus of the Yoon administration over the next 5 years.